The first laugh cut through the glass-walled conference room like a snapped wire, sharp and public, and it came when the black janitor's mop squeaked against the marble as he stepped in at the wrong moment. Shoulders squared, eyes lowered, wearing the blue uniform that still smelled of bleach, unaware that 40 white executives had turned to watch him the way people watch a stain spread. And when the CEO waved him forward with 2 fingers and said, "Since you're already here, why don't you clean up the mess you people usually leave behind?" The room erupted, and the man froze, heart hammering, because he knew this laugh carried it on his back for years, and his name was Isaiah Reed, 41, quietly competent, invisible by design, a man who arrived before dawn and left after dusk so the building could shine for others. And today he had been called in early, because the board wanted the building spotless for a merger announcement that promised obscene wealth, and Isaiah had tried to move silently along the wall. But the CEO, a tall white man named Richard Halvorson with silver hair and a predator's smile, had spotted him like a flaw in glass, and now every eye followed Isaiah as he pushed the mop toward a spill that didn't exist, his hands steady even as heat climbed his neck, while Halvorson leaned back and continued, "Relax, folks, he won't understand the numbers anyway." And another laugh rolled, louder, crueler, the kind that bounced off polished wood and settled into bones. And Isaiah nodded once, as if he accepted the joke, because that was safer, because fighting back never paid the bills, because silence kept you fed. And he worked the mop in slow arcs while they talked about leverage and market dominance as if those words weren't weapons too. And as he bent, the sleeve of his uniform rode up a fraction, revealing a sliver of dark ink against darker skin, just a hint of a tattoo that disappeared as quickly as it appeared, unnoticed by most, but not by Halvorson, whose eyes narrowed for half a second before he smirked and said, "Careful, don't drip on the chairs, those cost more than your car." And Isaiah murmured an apology, voice low, respectful, the way the job trained him to be, while inside a different voice counted breaths, reminding him why he was here, why he endured, why he cleaned floors instead of offices. Because this place was a crossroads, because information gathered quietly was power, and power was patient. And as the meeting dragged on, the mockery shifted from jokes to casual erasure, executives stepping around him as if he were furniture, one woman lifting her heels so he could pass, another complaining about the smell of cleaner, and Isaiah absorbed it all, cataloging faces, habits, tells the way Halvorson tapped his ring when lying, the way the CFO avoided eye contact when discussing liabilities, the way the legal counsel's hand shook when the merger's offshore accounts came up, details that mattered to someone else, somewhere else, someone who trusted Isaiah with things no one in this room would ever imagine. And when he finished, he retreated toward the door, hoping to disappear again. But Halvorson stood abruptly, chair scraping, and said, "Hold on, I'm not done with you." And the room quieted, anticipation buzzing, because humiliation is entertainment when you're not the one bleeding. And Halvorson walked closer, looming, his cologne sharp, and said, "You know, we're discussing security upgrades, and it got me thinking, do you even have clearance to be on this floor?" And Isaiah met his gaze for the first time, eyes dark, calmed, and said, "I'm assigned here, sir," which drew a few chuckles. And Halvorson leaned in, voice dropping, "Assigned by who?" And Isaiah hesitated just long enough for the silence to stretch, then answered, "Facilities," because that was true. And Halvorson laughed again, loud and satisfied, and said to the room, "See, that's the ceiling of ambition right there." And he reached out, fingers brushing Isaiah's sleeve as if to emphasize the point, pushing it back slightly, and this time the tattoo showed more clearly, a clean black line forming part of a symbol, sharp, deliberate, not decorative. And Halvorson's smile faltered for a fraction of a heartbeat, so brief most missed it, but Isaiah saw, and something shifted, a subtle tightening around the CEO's eyes, a pause before the next insult. And Halvorson cleared his throat and said, "Anyway, get out of here," as if regaining control. And Isaiah nodded and turned, pulse steady, because he had seen that look before, years ago, on another white man's face in another room when his sleeve slipped and a secret brushed daylight. And as he closed the door behind him, the laughter resumed, but it sounded thinner now, strained, and Isaiah leaned against the wall in the hallway, breathing once, twice, letting the weight settle, because the humiliation was only the first movement. Because he had come here knowing he would be seen as less, knowing they would underestimate the man with the mop, because underestimation was camouflage. And as he walked away, the radio on his belt crackled softly, a coded tone meant for him alone, and he pressed it off without answering, eyes forward, steps measured, already planning the next phase, already aware that somewhere behind that glass, Richard Halvorson's confidence had sprung a hairline fracture, and fractures, Isaiah knew, always spread. Isaiah did not slow as he moved through the corridor where the carpet muffled footsteps and the walls displayed framed photos of white men shaking hands with other white men, decades of power frozen in smiles, because slowing would have meant letting the anger bloom too fast, and anger made mistakes, and he had survived by being meticulous, by letting insults slide off like water off sealed concrete. And as he turned a corner toward the service elevator, his radio crackled again, softer this time. The coded double-click that meant urgency without panic, and he thumbed it on just long enough to murmur, "I saw him," before clicking it off, knowing that was enough, knowing the man on the other end would understand the weight of that sentence. Because this wasn't about pride or revenge, not yet, this was about confirmation. And as the elevator doors slid open, he stepped inside, alone, the hum of descent vibrating through his boots, and he thought of the first time he'd met Richard Halvorsen, though Halvorsen had not known it then, had not noticed the quiet black man wiping down a railing at a charity gala 10 years earlier, had not noticed how Isaiah listened while he bragged about cutting corners, about crushing a competitor with regulatory favors, about buying silence with donations. And Isaiah had filed that away too, had followed the thread, had learned who Halvorsen answered to and who answered to him, had learned the shape of his fear, which was exposure, always exposure. And the elevator chimed, doors opening onto the basement, where the air smelled of oil and paper, and Isaiah stepped out, passing the security desk where a young white guard barely glanced up, used to him, trained not to see him, and Isaiah signed out, grabbed a fresh mop head from the supply closet, and headed back toward the stairwell, because his job today was to be everywhere and nowhere. And as he climbed, he replayed the moment the sleeve had shifted, the microsecond when Halvorsen's pupils had dilated, when recognition had flared and been smothered, and that reaction mattered more than any insult, because men like Halvorsen only feared two things: loss of control and ghosts from their past. And Isaiah's tattoo was both, a minimalist mark inked on his forearm years ago in a basement with one light bulb and a promise, a symbol that meant accountability to a network that did not forgive. And as he reached the executive floor again, the meeting was breaking up, doors opening, laughter spilling out, the executives flushed with confidence, talking about yachts and bonuses, and Isaiah moved with practiced timing, stepping in just as a spill was actually made, coffee sloshing from a paper cup as a junior analyst bumped into the CFO, and before anyone could bark at him, Isaiah was there, kneeling, blotting the carpet eyes down, while the CFO cursed and the analyst apologized. And above him Halvorsen's voice cut in, "Watch where you're going." Sharp, irritated, and Isaiah felt the CEO's gaze on him again, heavier now, curious despite itself. And when Isaiah stood, he caught Halvorsen staring at his sleeve, calculating, and for a moment neither spoke, the air tight, until Halvorsen snapped, "Clean it properly," and walked away. But his stride was shorter, his shoulders tense, and Isaiah followed at a distance, pushing his cart, watching as Halvorsen ducked into his office and closed the door harder than necessary. And that was the second confirmation, because powerful men did not slam doors unless something rattled them. And Isaiah turned away, heart steady, because the real work was happening elsewhere, because while Halvorsen obsessed over a memory he hoped was wrong, others were moving, documents being copied, calls being logged, and Isaiah's phone vibrated once in his pocket, a message he did not need to read to know its content, because the timing told him everything. And as the day stretched, the building shifted, a subtle nervous energy creeping in as rumors of the merger spread through cubicles and break rooms. And Isaiah listened, nodding when spoken to, collecting fragments. And late in the afternoon, Halvorsen emerged again, mask reset, calling for his assistant, barking orders. And when he passed Isaiah, he stopped, voiced low, meant to intimidate. "You've been here a long time," and Isaiah answered, "Yes, sir," and Halvorsen said, "Too long," with a thin smile. And Isaiah met his eyes, just briefly, and said, "Long enough," and something in his tone made Halvorsen stiffen, made the assistant glance between them, confused, and Halvorsen laughed too loudly and walked on, but his hand shook as he reached for his phone, and Isaiah knew the call he was making, knew the name he would say, and sure enough, an hour later, Isaiah was in the supply room when the radio crackled again, this time 3 clicks, the signal to move, and he finished his task calmly, clocked out, and left the building as the sun dipped, blending into the crowd on the sidewalk, a black man in work boots among thousands, unseen. And he walked 3 blocks to a nondescript office building, took the stairs to the 3rd floor, and knocked twice, paused, knocked once, and when the door opened, he stepped into a room filled with screens and files and a half-dozen white men and women who all stood when they saw him, respect immediate, palpable, and one of them, a white-haired man with a scar on his cheek, said he saw the mark, and Isaiah nodded, and the man exhaled slowly, "Good," and Isaiah rolled his sleeve up fully now, the tattoo clear, stark, a sigil that tied him to an organization built to dismantle empires that rotted from the inside, an organization that had recruited him not because of his anger but because of his discipline, because he could endure humiliation without cracking, because he understood systems. And as they gathered around a table, maps and timelines spreading, Isaiah spoke softly, outlining what he had observed, and the others listened, adjusting plans. And when he finished, the white-haired man said, "He's already panicking," and Isaiah replied, "He should, because the trap was set. Because tomorrow would bring the board back together, because Halvorsen would make a move to protect himself, and in doing so, he would expose everything." And as Isaiah left the room later that night, heading home to a small apartment that hid a life far larger than anyone guessed. He allowed himself one breath of anticipation, because the humiliation had done its job, because underestimation had opened the door, and tomorrow, when the door slammed shut, it would be on someone else's fingers. The boardroom was louder the next morning, confidence amplified into arrogance, because the merger announcement was scheduled for noon and the numbers looked unstoppable on paper, and Richard Halvorsen stood at the head of the table smiling too widely, talking too fast, while Isaiah Reed waited in the hallway outside with his cart, listening through the door as voices overlapped, and when laughter burst out again, it sounded forced, brittle, and that was when the radio on Isaiah's belt clicked once, the final signal, and he took a breath and pushed the door open without knocking, because no one ever expected the janitor to interrupt, and the room froze as 40 white faces turned, irritation ready. But before Halvorsen could speak, the head of legal cleared her throat and said, "This meeting is confidential," and Isaiah replied calmly, "So is the warrant," and the words landed like a dropped plate, shattering the room into silence, because behind Isaiah the door swung wider and 3 men and 2 women stepped in wearing plain suits and badges that caught the light. "Federal insignia unmistakable," and Halvorsen's smile collapsed, color draining from his face so fast it was as if someone had pulled a plug, and he stammered, "What is this?" as chairs scraped and executives half rose, panic rippling, and Isaiah stepped aside, no longer holding a mop but a slim folder, his posture different now, grounded, and he said, "Richard Halvorsen, you are under investigation for securities fraud, money laundering, bribery, and conspiracy," each word measured, rehearsed, earned, and Halvorsen laughed weakly, looking around for support, but no one met his eyes, because fear had turned the room inward, and he pointed at Isaiah, voice cracking, "This is absurd. He's a janitor," and Isaiah met his gaze steadily and rolled his sleeve up to the elbow, revealing the tattoo in full, the symbol that had haunted Halvorsen's memory overnight, and Halvorsen's mouth opened and closed, recognition flooding back, because he had seen it before, years ago, on a photograph slid across a table by a man who had warned him to stop, a man who had disappeared soon after, and Halvorsen whispered, "You," and Isaiah nodded once, because yes, it was him, because yes, he had been there at every step, quietly, and the agents moved forward, reading rights, hands on shoulders, and as Halvorsen was led away, he twisted back, desperation flaring, and spat, "You think you've won," and Isaiah answered softly, "I think you're done," and the door closed behind them, leaving the boardroom in stunned silence, executives shaking, phones buzzing with alerts as news broke faster than they could process, stock prices plummeting, years of power evaporating in real time, and Isaiah stood there a moment longer, letting it settle, because endings deserved witness, and then he turned to leave, but a white woman at the table, tears streaking her face, whispered, "Who are you?" And Isaiah paused, considering, then said, "Someone who cleans up messes," and walked out, because explanations were luxuries, and in the hallway the security guard stared at him with new eyes, confusion and awe mixing, and Isaiah nodded politely and kept going, because respect earned through fear was still respect, but it wasn't the point, and outside, cameras already clustered, reporters shouting questions, but Isaiah slipped through a side door, unnoticed again, because invisibility was still useful, and he walked 3 blocks to the same nondescript building, climbed the stairs, and entered the operations room where the white-haired man and the others watched feeds in silence, satisfaction tempered by professionalism, and the man said, "Clean," and Isaiah replied, "Contained," and they shared a look that acknowledged years of work, sacrifices made quietly, and as files were archived and calls made, Isaiah allowed himself to sit, the adrenaline ebbing, and he thought of the laughter from the day before, how small it seemed now, how hollow, and hours later, when the dust settled and arrests multiplied and the merger lay in ruins, Isaiah returned to his apartment, removed his boots, and sat by the window watching the city pulse, thinking of the boy he had been, underestimated early, taught by the world to shrink, who had learned instead to observe, to endure, to build strength without spectacle, and his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number that simply read, "Thank you," and Isaiah deleted it, because gratitude was not currency here, justice was, and the next morning he woke early out of habit, made coffee, and put on a clean shirt that wasn't blue, and as sunlight filled the room, he smiled, not in triumph but in relief, because the power had never been about humiliating anyone back, it had been about balance, about proving that the quiet man in the corner might be the one holding the ledger, and somewhere across the city, Richard Halvorsen sat in a holding cell replaying a moment when a sleeve slipped and his world cracked, and Isaiah Reed stepped into a new day unseen, exactly as he chose.